Good morning. I'm Don Fry, President and CEO of the Greater Baltimore Committee, and welcome to the GBC's annual General Assembly Legislative Forum. Before we begin our program today, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the passing of Maryland State Senate President Emeritus Thomas V. Mike Miller, who died on January 15th. As many know, Senator Miller was a commanding presence in the General Assembly, where he served for 50 years. His record of public service and legislative accomplishments are legendary. He loved the Maryland General Assembly and respected its members irrespective of party affiliation. A student of history, he'll be treated in the annals of Maryland's history as a giant. While the business of governing goes on in Annapolis, Senator Miller's passing adds a sad note to the start of this year's legislative session. I would ask that everyone please join in a moment of silence to remember Senator Miller and his work for the citizens of Maryland. Thank you. Let me remind you of a couple of protocols for today's meeting. All attendees will be on mute throughout the meeting. If you have not submitted a question, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to do so. GBC staff will monitor the questions and forward it to the moderator. If you're calling in and can't use that function, please text the question to 410-299-6587. Again, that's 410-299-6587. This year's legislative session, the third in a four-year term of office, is sure to be a session like no other due to its virtual nature, social distancing, and other measures that have been put in place to protect the health and safety of legislators and the public. That said, there are many important issues the General Assembly must tackle this year. These issues include passing a balanced budget, helping Maryland residents and businesses recover economically from the COVID-19 pandemic, potential overrides of a number of the governor's legislative vetoes last year, including a bill to reform education based on the Kirwan Commission's recommendations, sports betting, legislation on police reform, and legislation to address racial equity and social justice issues. These are just a few of the challenging issues that will be addressed in an action-packed General Assembly session. The mission of the GBC is to bring the corporate and civic community together to find solutions to problems that affect our region's competitiveness and viability. Active engagement in the activities of the Maryland General Assembly is an essential and necessary role of the Greater Baltimore Committee. During the 2021 legislative session, the GBC will support legislative proposals that increase the state's competitiveness for economic growth and job creation. The GBC Legislative Priorities for the session can be found on our website, gbc.org. Each year after the legislative session commences, the GBC extends an opportunity for our membership and their guests to hear from key legislative leaders about the issues that will dominate the 90-day session. This includes issues that may have not yet surfaced in the media, but will likely emerge in the weeks ahead, as well as the impact that the state budget and legislative action may have on business operations and other legislative priorities of the GBC. In a minute, you will meet our panelists, but first I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the generosity of the sponsors of today's program. Our ambassador sponsors, BGE, Care First, and University of Maryland Medical System. Our signature sponsors, AT&T, MedStar Health, Merit Companies. Our State House sponsor, Comcast. Our contributing sponsor, Harris Jones and Malone, and our media sponsor, The Daily Record. We thank each of these sponsors for their financial support of today's program. We're pleased to welcome back a familiar face to serve as moderator of today's program, Jeff Salkin of Maryland Public Television. Jeff has regularly hosted coverage of the state addresses, gubernatorial inaugurations, and has served as moderator for numerous political debates. Throughout the year, he keeps us up to date on politics in the state legislature with his State Circle program. He's a former executive producer of Bloomberg Morning News and publisher of Wall Street Week. He earns his bachelor's degree in economics from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. We're fortunate to have him back to his home state of Maryland, where we've enjoyed watching him and dealing with him for an MPT for over 25 years. It's my pleasure to present Jeff Salkin. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us today.
Don, great pleasure to be with you again. And I always look forward, Don, to seeing you personally early in the morning for these events. And it's because, of course, everybody knows you're a great guy, but you're also the person who has the parking validation stickers, which is obviously not an issue this year.
This year.
Let me, Don did a great overview of the top issues of the session. Let me quickly add two things that everybody should be paying attention to. One is the state's progress in rolling out vaccines. How's Maryland doing relative to other states in terms of getting needles in people's arms? And the second part of that is the state doing a good job of distributing the vaccines equitably across all parts of society, and it will have a direct impact on our ability to quickly reopen, get the economy back to full speed. The second part of this that also is an economic issue, but a very human issue, is the process of reopening schools. And most people know there's a fight going on between the governor and the teachers union about whether it should be virtual school or real school over the next couple of months. The part of it I would call attention to is the kids who have no school. They don't have real school, they don't have virtual school, they never connected. We don't actually know what the number is. A few months ago, Baltimore County revealed that they had 1,300 students who hadn't connected at all starting last March through the summer. They were just lost, and Baltimore County is 13% of the number of school kids in the state, which makes the math easy. If you projected it out, there were 10,000 lost kids, and we don't know what the number is now. I emailed Baltimore County School PR last week for an update, didn't hear back. Hopefully it's way better, and maybe it's just a few thousand kids, but it's probably not zero. And these are cases, it's not it's not just focused on poor communities, it's rural communities, it's places where people don't have access to broadband. I mean, we're really fortunate that when the pandemic hit, there is widespread availability of broadband, but it's not universal. And if you send one of these hotspot devices to a kid in a rural area, there may be nothing to connect to. Even in a densely populated area, there frequently are dead spots. So I think it's a big issue. I don't know how those kids are going to be able to catch up when they haven't even been able to tread water over the last 9 or 10 months. Let me introduce the panel. We're fortunate to have with us 4 prominent members of the General Assembly this morning: the President of the Senate, the Honorable Bill Ferguson, the Honorable Michael Huff, who is the Senate Minority Whip and a member of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, Honorable Eric Luedke, the Majority Leader of the House of Delegates, and the Honorable Stephanie Smith, who is a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and also chair of the Baltimore City delegation. After a more formal introduction, each panelist will have 5 or 10 minutes to provide their perspective on the top issues. After the presentations, you'll have a chance to ask a question. There's a chat function. You can email Don. You can email me directly if you want, jeff@mpt.org. Maryland Public Television, MPT, it's just jeff@mpt.org. Now, before we turn to the legislators, to set up the fiscal situation, which obviously we went from strong economy to deep recession and are crawling our way out of it at this point. We're joined by David Romans, Fiscal and Policy Coordinator for the Department of Legislative Services. David has spent 27 years in Maryland state government, currently oversees the work of teams handling fiscal notes, which project the budget impact of proposed legislation, also budget analysis and local government matters. He was previously the principal deputy director of the Health Services Cost Review Commission and deputy secretary for the Department of Budget and Management. David, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to GBC for having me. I am going to go ahead and try to share my screen here. All right, so hopefully you're seeing my screen.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right, so it's always helpful to have some slides to show you the state budget outlook rather than just talking about numbers. So what I want to do is sort of give you a quick picture of the state revenue and kind of economic situation, and then give you some highlights of the state budget. This first slide shows you the revenue outlook and how it's changed from last March. So the state's official revenue estimate by the Board of Revenue Estimates came out in early March. It was before the pandemic hit Maryland. And while there was an awareness that there was a pandemic, no one knew what it would do to Maryland. So it just sort of ignored the impact on Maryland. So it's sort of a pre-pandemic revenue estimate that the General Assembly used to complete its budget work. And what this graphic shows you is how estimates of the revenues changed since that time. So the first revenue revision was in May, and that's the red bars. And for fiscal 20, the year that was almost done when the pandemic hit, was expected to reduce revenues by about 5%. And then you can see in 21 and 22, much more substantial double-digit revenue losses versus that March pre-pandemic estimate. But then when we came to September and we had some actual experience with the pandemic, you can see in the yellow bars, the revenue revisions changed greatly. It was only for fiscal 20 about a little under 0.5% down from the March estimate, and then a little over 2% in fiscal 21. And fiscal 22, the Board of Revenue Estimates thought was going to be better than had been projected in March. And you can see that it continued again in December when they revised their estimates with a few more months of data. And the December estimates are what are used for the governor's budget. Part of the reason you see the growth starting in fiscal 22 is the assumption is as the vaccine gets rolled out, that the economy will essentially recover and recover very quickly in fiscal 22. But I mean, I think a lot of people are surprised about how modest the revenue impact is in fiscal 21. And this next slide attempts to show you part of what's going on. So this is state and local wage withholding. So your income tax withholding by industry for calendar 20 growth versus the prior calendar year. And I guess big picture, wage withholding increased by 746 million or 5% in calendar 20. Very surprising to people. Now, a big part of that, and you can see it in that left-hand side of the graphic, is unemployment insurance benefits. 254 million of the growth in withholding was withholding on unemployment insurance benefits. So that's a third of the growth. So when you exclude that, withholding grew a little over 3%. A part of that growth is because some of our counties increased their local income tax rates. When you adjust for that, it's still about 2.5% growth. And what you see in the chart is that some industries actually saw very healthy growth, both in terms of the dollars of withholding, and the yellow line shows you the percentage change. And you can see about 5% growth in professional and business services and finance and insurance and health and social assistance, even stronger growth in retail trade. But we also had, some areas of the economy that really have struggled. And not surprisingly, as you can see on the far right-hand side, there are arts and entertainment, there are accommodation and food services. So it's really been an unequal recession. It's really hit very hard on specific industries. Well, at least from the withholding data, a lot of other industries are doing fine and kind of growing as you would normally expect them to do. Now, one of the things that helped prop up, in a sense, the economy is all the stimulus money that's come in. And this graphic shows you there's been about 30 billion of federal and state stimulus money put into the Maryland economy. Now, this includes the December congressional actions, so it really hasn't hit the economy, but those dollar numbers are in this graphic. So where did that 30 billion go? About 62% went for business assistance. Almost all of that is the Paycheck Protection Program at the federal level. Then you see over 3 billion for health, and not surprisingly, given the pandemic. And there's been a substantial amount for transportation as well. More than half of that went to WMATA, a much smaller share going to the Maryland Transit Administration. But you can get a sense of how there is money coming in. And certainly that business assistance helped the business community and helped support that wage withholding. The other thing that's not shown here are two things. Unemployment insurance benefits. Federally paid benefits, which a lot of it is the enhanced $600 earlier in the pandemic, now $300 payments per week to people who are getting unemployment. accumulated to more than 7 billion in calendar 2020. So that was a huge infusion of money into our economy. And the other thing that we received a lot of federal money from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, which is the old food stamp program. A lot of the growth is just because, unfortunately, we see a lot more people participating in that program. But we also are now getting a 15% increase in the benefit for those people for the next 6 months. So this, more than $1 billion of additional money coming into the economy there. The next slide just shows you for the December stimulus, the part that we haven't really seen flow into the economy yet, where we think that's going to go. And again, the biggest share is business assistance. Again, the Paycheck Protection Program is the bulk of that. Another large chunk for transportation. Again, about half of that is for WMATA. And then K through 12 schools is over 770 million will go direct to the school systems from the federal government. And it's allocated based on Title I, so based on low income students. So you can see in more money for health and human services and so forth. All right, so then the next topic I just wanted to touch here. Here's the unemployment insurance, of course, was extended in that December benefit. Another 11 weeks of benefits are being provided, and $300 per week extra for that 11-week period. And the SNAP benefit, as I mentioned, was increased by 15%. So the other picture to sort of understand what's going on in the state budget and the state economy is the demand for entitlement programs. So this graphic, the red and yellow are the caseload trends in Medicaid and SNAP, respectively. And you can see Medicaid was already a very large program. We had 1.4 million people back in January 2020 enrolled. We're up closer to a little over 1.5 million now. So about a quarter of the state's population is in the Medicaid program at this point. The SNAP program went from about 600,000 participants back in January of last year to roughly 800,000 now. So we've seen a 33% increase. So you really can see how there are a lot of people suffering. And then the black bars are the temporary cash assistance, which provides cash assistance to some of the poorest families in Maryland. And you see a really considerable jump. We had about 40,000 people last January, which was about the lowest we've seen in 30 years. And then by June, we were up over 70,000. It was higher than we had seen during the Great Recession at any point. And it's come down some, but it's still at 60,000, 50% higher than back in January. So, while the economy is doing better than we expected, you can see certain industries are being hurt, and certainly there are a number of people who are really struggling and need quite a bit of assistance to get through the recession. All right, with that backdrop, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the governor's budget, just a couple of slides. First off, this is the total spending. The governor is proposing $49.4 billion of spending in fiscal 22. It's actually a $1.1 billion decrease from fiscal 21. The decrease is because there's so much federal CARES money in the fiscal 21 budget. In addition, the state budget assumes that SNAP caseload will drop in fiscal 22 as the economy recovers, and that takes a lot of federal money out of the budget. Some of the key details are shown in this next slide. First off, the governor is leaving about $1.2 billion in cash reserves for the general fund, most of it about $1 billion in the rainy day fund. So that represents about 6% of the state's general fund revenues. The governor, and I'll talk about this in a moment, has almost $670 million of tax relief targeted to certain groups in fiscal 21 and 22 in his budget plan. He has about $1.1 billion of budget balancing actions that require legislative approval through what's called the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. It's a combination of about $800 million of budget cuts and then some revenues as well, mainly by diverting revenues from other places. One of the areas of sort of interesting discretionary spending that the governor has put into the budget is he's got $214 million for K through 12 schools to hold them harmless for enrollment declines. Overall, statewide, we've seen about a 5% decline in enrollment this year as a result of the pandemic. So this $214 million makes sure that all the school systems will get a little bit more than they did in the current year. The governor has also included $152 million for for supplemental instruction and tutoring in the next fiscal year to help kids catch up who may have fallen behind due to the virtual learning environment. For vulnerable populations, the temporary cash assistance program that I mentioned earlier, each recipient will receive an extra $100 a month for the next 6 months through June. In addition, for providers who serve vulnerable populations, particularly those serving the developmentally disabled and people with behavioral health issues, the governor is accelerating a planned 4% rate increase. So instead of it starting in July, it started January 1st. And I guess the other big issue for the session, and certainly the governor didn't make an assumption about this, is the General Assembly has to consider whether to override the governor's veto on the Kerwin education initiative that was passed by the General Assembly last session. And that will certainly be a major issue. It's worth noting that even if the General Assembly overrides the veto, it would not have any impact on the fiscal 22 budget. The impacts would start in fiscal 23 and in future years, and it's phased in over a 10-year period. Governor's Relief Act. This is the major components of his tax relief proposals. One, he wants to exempt unemployment benefits from income taxes. His estimate is this will reduce state revenues by 70 million over fiscal 21 and 22 combined. It'll also reduce local income tax revenues. Our department will be releasing some estimates this week. They're quite a bit higher than that in terms of the fiscal impact. Another component of his plan is stimulus checks for people who receive the earned income tax credit in 2019 or will receive it in 2020. And that costs the state about $267 million, would put about $750 into a family's pocket, $450 for an individual. Small businesses would get some relief from the governor's proposal, as he would let businesses retain some of the sales tax that they collect, up to $3,000 a month for 4 months, starting once the bill is passed. So it's basically capped that you can't have more than 100,000 of income in a month in order to qualify to retain that money. And the final piece is to, and this is in an executive order as well, to try to delay changes in businesses' unemployment tax rates based on experience. We're going to sort of ignore the experience of any people who were laid off during the recession. So it helps protect businesses from really substantial tax increases for the next year. All right, so my final slide is just to give you a look at sort of the Department of Legislative Services forecast of the budget over the next few years using the governor's assumptions. And so, so what I'm showing here is the structural budget outlook. So what is that? That's ongoing revenues versus ongoing spending. So ignoring fund balances and kind of gimmicks that are used year to year to balance the budget. The budget that the governor's proposed for fiscal 22 is very close to structurally balanced. Maryland is rarely in this position, so this is actually an unusually good spot. We're only about 76 million short of structural balance. And in the subsequent years, we're estimating about a 400 to 500 million gap. That's certainly a significant issue, but for those of you who follow state government much, we often are looking at billion-dollar gaps in those out years. So this is actually somewhat better than the outlook if you looked 2 or 3 years ago when we were projecting. So that's really all I had to say about the state budget. I will stop screen sharing now.
Unmute myself. David, it was a great presentation, and we have a lot of questions for you, but let's get to the legislators first, and we'll begin, of course, with the President of the State Senate, Bill Ferguson. Senator Ferguson was elected President of the Senate 1 year ago. He's been a member of the Senate since 2011, previously Vice Chair of the Budget and Tax Committee. He earned his bachelor's degree from Davidson, Master of Arts in Teaching at Johns Hopkins University, and a Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland School of Law. We recognize the President of the Senate. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Jeff. Good morning to the fellow panelists and to Don and to all the members here this morning for our annual GBC kickoff. It's quite a testament. We are here. We are doing the GBC kickoff. It is officially session, except we're all looking at each other on a little square head. Such is life here in 2020 and 2021. But This has been an absolutely extraordinary year. And before I get into it, I just want to say, I want to thank David, who is consistently just providing excellent information to the legislature. And, I want to publicly praise him because I don't know how many weekends I have stolen from him asking for briefings. And so, I am very, very grateful for his hard work. And as you can tell from what the slides that you just saw, is that one of the beauties of the Department of Legislative Services is they really are able to hone things down to the things that matter the most. It's nonpartisan, it's very unbiased information. When we have crazy ideas, they are very quick to say, have you thought about another alternative? And so, we are so blessed and fortunate to have such talented professional staff to help us along the way. So where are we, other than in the midst of a pandemic? We are in this very, very precarious moment. This is an unbelievably important point in this entire pandemic experience. The good news is we are seeing vaccinations happen across the country faster than we would have expected to see a vaccine deployed for given a pandemic scenario, faster than we ever could have imagined. And that is a testament to kind of the beauty of scientists deciding on identifying a clear problem, coming together to collaborate and solving that problem. It didn't take 5 years. It didn't take 10 years like was sort of projected at the front end. Within the year of the pandemic, we have 4 different vaccine candidates, some of which that are being put into arms right this very second. That is absolutely incredible. And I think 10 years from now, we'll look back on that and really be kind of amazed at the pace at which innovation and technology were able to help us attack this virus. So that's the good news. The bad news, and David really kind of highlighted this in some of the budget outlook, is that we've had one of the most devastating experiences that we as humanity in the last 100 years have ever faced. And the most important challenge within that is that this pandemic has not been equal. Its impact has been incredibly inequitable and unequal. It is remarkable that you look at our top 30% of businesses in 2020, they outperformed what they did in 2019. In the midst of a pandemic, the top 30% of business industries in Maryland outdid prior year performance. The flip side of the story is the real story, and that's the bottom 30%. And we saw that with the tax withholdings from some of the early charts that David showed. We have had industries not just hurt or struggling, absolutely devastated. And here in Baltimore City, we know that story very well. Downtown, when you that is based on sort of tourism and hotel accommodations and restaurants and sort of what makes a city, these are all of the industries that have had the absolutely disparate impact. The other point is that it has not affected individuals equally. We have seen a disproportionate health outcome of this pandemic on Black and brown communities across the state of Maryland. And, I think we're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly why that is. But what we do know is that the existing gaps that existed, the existing inequities that existed prior to the pandemic have simply been exacerbated in ways that probably none of us could have ever imagined. So where do we go from here? Well, this is kind of I say it is an interesting point in this pandemic because we have a vaccination. The question right now is whether it gets distributed effectively, safely, and equitably. There are very few times where there is one issue that dominates everything else. If you care about education, if you care about business recovery, if you care about healthcare, if you care about transportation, all of it, everything comes down to one simple question: when and where can people get vaccinated? That is the single most important thing in state government right now. Where are we as a state of Maryland right now? We are 40 out of 50 states in our distribution of the vaccine. If you look at the number of doses that we have received versus those that have been administered, we are 49 out of 50 states. So in the state that has some of the greatest healthcare on the globe, that has the best public health institute on the globe, that has an infrastructure around healthcare and has a competitive advantage around healthcare, We are 40 out of 50 states in the administration of this vaccine, and 49 out of 50 if you look at how much we've received and how much we've actually gotten out. That is just, that's not debatable. That's not subjective. That is simply an objective perspective of where we are. That's a major problem, and it cannot continue because everything that we do depends on getting through this pandemic, and the only way we get through it is through vaccinations. We have in the Senate, the acting secretary has been nominated for confirmation. And as we considered what to do moving forward with the Department of Health, we circled back to a conversation that we had as part of this COVID work group that's been monitoring this pandemic throughout with the House and the Senate. When we asked the prior Secretary of Health, who ultimately is in charge of the vaccination program? Who owns it? Where does the buck stop? And Bobby Neal, who was the former Secretary of Health, was very clear, didn't take a beat, just said the buck stops with the Department of Health. If the program's not working, it's the Department of Health that's responsible. So as we consider whether or not to confirm the current acting secretary, we have to place the buck where it is. And that's with the Department of Health and the acting secretary. So every week, every Monday at 4 o'clock, the Senate has put together a vaccination oversight work group where we will be asking the secretary to present the progress from the prior week so that we're not the 49th out of 50 states in the administration of the vaccine. Right now, I think there's been way too much confusion between locals and state as to who's in charge, what the predictable doses are going to be. We have zero desire to micromanage the program. We simply want one answer to one simple question answered, and that is when and where can people get their vaccine? How much predictability can we give to Marylanders so that we can get past this? So that is the single most important thing, and it will affect every other aspect of what we do, because if we do not get out these vaccines, if we do not get past this pandemic, we'll continue to talk about policies, but we will not recover from the economic challenges that we've faced until we truly have our public health in place. And we have the path, we have the ingredients that are necessary to get us there. The question is whether or not we do it. So that is going to be the driving focus on the front end here. We also are going to spend, if by the time we leave the General Assembly session this year, we have to be able to answer to Marylanders, how do we make sure that we protected the most vulnerable Marylanders to ensure that they can get through this crisis so that when we've gotten this vaccine distributed, we can make 2021 the year of rebuilding and recovery. We have people that are hurting more than than we ever could have imagined in this once in 100-year event. And so what we have to do is be very targeted in our approach. The good news is, I think we have a federal administration and the Congress is poised to provide continual updates, investments to make sure that the state has the resources that are necessary. I have full faith in the Biden administration to put an urgent focus on ensuring that states have the resources they need to maintain and deal with this crisis. The governor has put forward a budget that we largely support. I would say the vast majority of the formulas that we care about, the investments in the priorities that are most important, have largely been funded. There are pieces here and there that we disagree with, but for the most part, the budget is a very sound budget. Last Wednesday, we received the Governor's Relief Act bill, which is his stimulus approach, economic recovery approach. And we read it across the desk last Wednesday when we received it. We'll be having a hearing in the Senate on that bill tomorrow. We will act very quickly on that legislation, but it won't look as it is today. What we know is that we have to be very, very targeted in our supports. There are some great pieces of support in that legislation, but there are a few things that are a little bit too broad and need to be narrowed down so that we can make sure that we're protecting the public services, the healthcare, and the educational opportunities of the most vulnerable Marylanders. Let me just sort of finish, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions around police reform, because this is an absolutely essential component of the work that we have ahead. And I've heard some people say, well, how is this related to the pandemic with police reform? I actually think the two are entirely aligned. And what we experienced this summer with the tragic murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the reactions to that That's nothing new here in Maryland. We've experienced this before, this pain and frustration and anger, and we had made steps in the past. The problem is we have not done enough to truly restore trust, accountability, and transparency in policing. It is absolutely essential that, in this moment when people are really fundamentally, reevaluating what is most important in their life, how do they protect their family? How do they protect those around them? That we uphold the social contract that says that law enforcement and the communities that they serve must have mutual respect and trust. We cannot say that's the case right now. It is not, justice is not equally being applied across the board, and that has to change. And so this year we're going to have very hard conversations, but we are going to move forward an aggressive and thoughtful package to truly restore trust, accountability, and transparency in policing. I will hand it over to my very, very excellent colleagues who are, we are very fortunate that I am very fortunate to have alongside me, because I know that they will hit these very well. But I do just want to end on one positive note, is that through human history, when you look through pandemics, an interesting fact emerges. In the post-pandemic period, in the time immediately following pandemics, you often see some of the most innovative, creative, and flourishing periods for humanity. And it makes sense, because as we've been locked in, as we've been scared, when we reemerge from this crisis, when we do have the ability to rebuild and recover, we truly, truly have an opportunity like not many generations have had to use what we have learned over this year to create the society that I think we all believe is possible. So that's what keeps me going. That's what pushes me every day. And I look forward to making sure we uphold Marylanders' trust in us this upcoming session.
Thank you, Senator. Next presenter this morning, I did unmute myself, is Senator Michael Huff, who was elected to the state Senate in 2014, representing Frederick and Carroll counties. Prior to this session, Senator Huff was elected to the Senate Republican leadership team. He holds the number 2 position in the GOP caucus. Senator Huff currently serves as a member of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee, and Senator Huff graduated from Towson University with a bachelor's degree in political science. Senator, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for having me. I guess I'll start off. Now time for the rest of the story. First on vaccines, I'd just like to say that, the number one problem is that we just haven't been getting enough of the vaccines. That's first. And the second, in my area in Frederick County, these local health departments have really just not been equipped to hand these out. So I think as far as when we get to the private sector, when we get to the governor's plan, which has the Giant Foods, the Walmarts, everybody else handing them out, I think that you'll see a greater efficiency when the private sector starts getting involved, because these local health departments have just they didn't have call centers set up. Some of them weren't working on my area. They weren't working on weekends. Some of them were working regular hours. They just were not stepping up and doing what they needed to be done. And I know I was critical very early on of some of the actions they were doing. But I am hopeful. I mean, we've seen this, the private sector has stepped up time and time again when we had a lack of masks, when we had a lack of tests, when we had a lack of ventilators, heck, when we had a lack of toilet paper. That's the great thing about our system, the capitalist system is free market system, is the private sector is going to step up. And that's why we have new drugs coming online. We obviously have Pfizer, Moderna, but now we're talking about Johnson & Johnson and others that are coming online. So I think the innovation that we have from the free market is going to help fix this. And I do think the governor's plan about using the giants and using the free market Walmarts will be a better distribution model than what we've had. As far as taxes goes, I'd like to bring up that real briefly because you talked about, Don, in the beginning, the economic competitiveness of Maryland as compared to our surrounding states. That's a big deal for me. Being in Frederick County, my district directly borders Virginia, directly borders Pennsylvania. West Virginia is 5 miles away. So anytime that we go to increase alcohol taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, it makes it much more harder for my constituencies and small businesses to compete in my area. And what I don't want to see is us increase a bunch of taxes like we did in the last economic downturn under the O'Malley administration, where we increased taxes over 50 times. So, and unfortunately, this time in the General Assembly, we're looking at doing some of those mistakes again. We're looking at increasing or putting new taxes on Netflix services, things that people are now they're all quarantined in their home watching, you know, all these streaming services. We're looking at increasing taxes on digital advertising, something that small businesses need. Combined reporting is something that's being seriously talked about. Combined reporting would be is a terrible policy. It incentivizes national corporations to take their least productive, least profitable parts of their businesses and stick them in Maryland. And some of the other ideas they're talking about is increasing wealth income taxes, taxes on the top 1%. We tried that. That policy was so bad that we actually came back and had to repeal it. Because what people do is they start fleeing, they start going to Florida, they start going to Texas, states with no income tax, zero. And just lastly, I'd like to say as a member of judicial proceedings, criminal justice is a big issue. I sure hope that we can do what we did a couple years ago. We did do policing reform. We did it the same year that we did the Justice Reinvestment Act. And we actually passed it through the Senate almost unanimously, both policies, both huge groundbreaking policies. But if we go too far, if we do actions that with policing, if we go too far to the left, there's another problem in that Baltimore City right now is short 500 police officers. So if we make it so that we disincentivize or we make it too punitive towards police officers to go to the other end, we also have a problem in the state of violent crime, which still needs to be addressed. Last year, the Senate passed the governor's crime package. The House took no action on it. And in the interim, we saw again over 300 people murdered in the city of Baltimore. Shootings were up in Baltimore County. My county had 16 homicides. We've never had more than 6 or 7. And what we should do is the governor's package was correct, is targeting the people that again and again and again we're seeing. It's a small group of individuals who are buying handguns illegally and using them in homicides. And these people, 86% of them have all been in the criminal justice system before, and most of them have been charged with carrying guns illegally before. So when we're talking about building a better Maryland and having a better business community, it's not just taxes, but simple law and order is important. And when you have the city of Baltimore, again, over 300 homicides, we just cannot continue to turn a blind eye to that. And so I'll just give you one quick example and I'll stop. I introduced legislation this week we had a hearing on. In the state of Maryland, it is a felony to use if you use a handgun in the commission of a felony, it is a violent crime. Except for 3 years ago, the General Assembly, in their wisdom, we put an exception that the one exception was if you're dealing drugs, you don't get that as a violent crime with use of a handgun. Now, why would we do that? Any other felony in the state, if you use a handgun, it's a violent crime, with the exception of the one that is tied to the most violence, gang activity, and homicides, the dealing of drugs. There's actually a drug dealer loophole in our laws. We need to fix that. We need to hold those people accountable. So I'm hopeful this session we can address in a very targeted way. No one's talking about mandatory minimums or going back to the policies of the 80s, anything like that. I did the Justice Reinvestment. I'm very familiar with all this stuff. But we're talking about a very targeted package at this small group of people who again and again are committing violent crimes. And we're seeing are responsible for the homicide numbers that are extremely unacceptably high throughout our state.
Senator, thank you. Next, we'd like to introduce Delegate Eric Luedke, who has served in the House of Delegates since 2011. He has been the majority leader in the House since 2019, member of House Ways and Means, and he chairs the Revenue Subcommittee. Delegate Luedke earned his bachelor's in government and history and a master's in education from the University of Maryland, College Park. Welcome, Delegate Luedke.
Go Terps. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate it. And thanks again to Don and GBC for, I mean, first of all, more than 60 years of advocacy, but for doing this event. It's always great to have a chance to join you all. You know, to be more additive than repetitive to what the Senate president said. I'll say this: we're in a moment of crisis. It's absolutely a moment of crisis, and it's a moment where we need to all come together. And you know, I think Annapolis has a long tradition of working together across party lines, between the two chambers, between the branches of government. We need that now more than ever. Now's not the time for partisan attacks or disinformation or spin or any of that stuff. In the House, what we're focused on primarily are two things. The first, obviously, is COVID, right? The immediate response to COVID in terms of, as we've discussed, vaccines and testing, which still remains an issue, and the long-term response to COVID in the sense that the pandemic has revealed, if we did not know it before, some of the challenges we face as a society, some of the inequities, some of the needs that haven't been met, like access to broadband, the opportunity for people to work and attend school remotely, like the challenges we've seen in terms of health disparities, the fact that this pandemic has affected low-income communities and communities of color at disproportionate rates. So, we are very focused right now on addressing those issues. We are also, as was referred to earlier, inspired by the outcry we've seen from the public, not only in response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but what I think has become more obvious to all of us who maybe hadn't been paying full attention to it, that we still live in a racially unequal society, and that we need to fix that. And that fix is not just about criminal justice reform. It's not just about getting policing right and fixing the disproportionality in who ends up in our prisons. It's also about our economy, and it's about our healthcare system, and it's about our schools. We promise in our Constitution, both the federal and the state Constitution, this idea that we are all equal, and that we should all have an equal chance to succeed in life. And as a country, we have never lived up to that ideal, and it's about darn time we do. So the Speaker of the House, Adrian Jones, announced last week a racial equity agenda, a Black agenda, which is going to focus on many of those issues, and in particular, wealth inequality and economic inequality. So, those are the two major issues that we're focused on right now in the House. Obviously, there are dozens of smaller and ancillary issues that people are concerned about, and we will address them all. Let me just hit on a couple of things in detail. One is, the pandemic has forced us as a legislature to rethink how we do business. Much of our business obviously is being done remotely right now. And, that has presented challenges and created some discomfort for people that have been used to the way we've been doing things for a while. But it's also been an opportunity in the sense that it has forced the legislature to become more open and transparent and accessible than ever in its history. We're not only streaming our committee hearings now, we're streaming committee voting sessions and subcommittee meetings. For those of you who, have opinions about some of the decisions we make, but can't always take half a day off of work to drive down to Annapolis and wait a couple hours in the hearing room to testify, we're doing remote testimony. So, we really encourage you to take advantage of the innovations we're seeing in the legislative arena to participate and to share your opinions with us. And let me just mention, since they've been topics of conversation over the last couple of weeks, a couple things about the Relief Act that's been proposed by the governor, and a couple things about school reopening. First, in terms of the Relief Act, I think, the governor's proposals, there's a lot of good stuff there, frankly. A lot of great Democratic ideas that he's turned into this bill. There are some weaknesses, however. And as we're considering it over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at those weaknesses and trying to fix them. Just one example is that the major business relief in that proposal is tied to the sales tax, which is great if you're a business that collects the sales tax. And if you're a services-based business that doesn't collect sales tax, means you get absolutely nothing out of it. So we need to figure out how to better target the business relief that's in that bill to make sure that it's focused squarely on those small businesses that have been hit hardest by the recession and the pandemic, things like food service and accommodations, personal services, things like that. Finally, on school reopening, because that was a topic of conversation last week. Frankly, I was a little frustrated with last week's press conference by the governor. I think the Baltimore Sun got it right that the governor needs to play a little better than others. We should all be coming together and figuring out how to reopen schools safely. That isn't going to happen by threatening or bullying teachers or school systems, or hinting that you might take away someone's teaching license because they're afraid for their health. It's going to happen if we're working together. It's going to happen if we're providing consistent testing in the schools, if we're providing better access to vaccines, if we're providing funding for PPE and HVAC systems in schools. Getting the schools reopened is important, but we need to do it right. We can't just yell at people, right? So I'm hopeful that all of the tension and frustration we've seen in our politics over the last few months, people will rise above it. That people will rise above the partisanship and the disinformation and the throwing of rhetorical bombs, and they'll come together, both the leaders and the people of the state, and try to solve these problems. We are a great state with great people and great leaders. And I think now is the time for us to demonstrate it. And I'm happy to turn it back to Jeff to introduce one of those great leaders, Delegate Smith, who's been doing a fantastic job, if I can say so, helping be a voice for the city of Baltimore and its needs in Annapolis. So Jeff, right back to you.
Thank you, Delegate. And before I introduce Delegate Smith, just a reminder that coming up is your questions and answers. If you have a question on Zoom, you may be able to enter a question in the chat box, which Lisa or someone at the GBC can forward to me, or you can email me directly, jeff@mpt.org. Now, Delegate Stephanie Smith has been a member of the House of Delegates since way back in 2019. She's a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and the Legislative Black Caucus. She is the chair of the city delegation to the House of Delegates. And Stephanie Smith is a graduate of Hampton University, earned her master's at the University of Delaware and her law degree at Howard University. I would say, please welcome Delegate Smith, and everybody will applaud, but it doesn't happen virtually. So Delegate Smith, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I feel the applause and I see some signing, and I appreciate that too. Thank you to Dawn, the GBC organizers, and to all who made time this morning to just hear from us about the direction of our state through the 2021 session. I want to take the lead from my majority leader and be additive and discuss a few things on top of the great things that have been laid out by my colleagues, starting with the Senate President on down. So one of the things I think it's really important to emphasize, and it's appropriate because of the group we're before, is that economic justice is just as central to the racial equity fight as issues of criminal justice reform. And that's something that, quite frankly, sometimes gets lost. We're in the month where we just celebrated the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And sometimes we forget the very last thing he was doing in his life before it was unjustly taken from him was that he was fighting for economic rights and fair pay for sanitation workers in Memphis. So there's always been a close connection between racial justice and economic justice. So I just wanted to kind of ground that conversation in kind of the moment we find ourselves in. So as was noted, I mean, there have been disparities both nationally and within the state of Maryland as it comes to rates of employment, to rates of small business startups, and also just the ability for firms that have been owned by minorities and Blacks in Maryland to remain as competitive as they would like to be because of a lot of the systemic obstacles. And that's why I'm really pleased that not only Speaker Adrian Jones has an agenda to remedy some of these challenges, but also there was a work group launched by the Senate to also address some of these issues too, led by the President Pro Tem Griffith. So this is something that is being discussed, across the General Assembly, and it's timely. What that means for the GBC, I think, is a couple of things. When we have strong and thriving Black business, that's good for business overall. We're in a state where roughly 1 out of every 3 Marylanders is Black. And when you see that there's still a great disparity in some of our economic outcomes, that is a lag and a drag on our overall competitiveness as a state and as a region. And there's a couple of things that we can be doing in the short term to build towards a more equitable outcome across the board. And one of the things that the speaker is holding up is just looking at who we're doing business with as a state, looking at the diversity of their boards, looking at some of their investments in communities of need, and really making sure that we're doing business as a state with businesses that realize the value of ensuring that all Marylanders have a shot. Another thing that sometimes I don't think is grounded in the context of economic empowerment, but is really important, is that we have a lasting, unfortunate legacy of not funding our state historically Black colleges and universities at a rate that they need it to be. I'm a proud alum of 2 HBCUs, but they're both private. every HBCU in Maryland is a state institution. So it's a very different landscape and reality. And when we adequately fund these institutions, we're not only investing in future workers, future innovators, future small business leaders, we're also ensuring that these institutions that function as anchors within their communities can also ignite further business development in the communities that surround them. So when you consider that 50% of Maryland's HBCUs are located in Baltimore, I think we have a big stake in ensuring that those institutions are adequately funded, are offering dynamic, competitive programming, and that they can also realize their capital needs so that they have safe and inviting environments, but also those things are they ignite innovation around them. And that's really something that I think sometimes is forgotten when we think about the efforts that have been made by our speaker and by the General Assembly overall to ensure that we kind of right that wrong and that legacy of educational inequity at the higher education level. But there are a couple of other things that I think are worth re-mentioning because they're incredibly important. 2020 for Baltimore is still largely framed around the staggering levels of violence that have been experienced, as well as the pandemic that we know has upended life as we know it in every way, from education to work and to obviously healthcare. And I think as has been spoken by others, interwoven in all of those challenges are the legacy of racial inequity and racial injustice that are not just experienced in Maryland, but are experienced nationally. So we can't keep thinking we can kind of work around some of those challenges. We have to work through them. And it's going to take a lot of partnership, a lot of really tough conversations. But I have full confidence in the capabilities of my colleagues in the Maryland General Assembly and our partners in the business community, the faith community, and other stakeholders to really do something transformative so that we can have a more sustainable and inclusive economic landscape. When I was reviewing the GBC's 2021 priorities, I was really pleased how much they were in alignment with the spirit of having a stronger and more inclusive business environment for all Marylanders. And, looking at how we can more adequately capitalize and support small business and minority firms, that's right, part and parcel with what we care about, because we know some of these firms were some of the most adversely impacted by this global pandemic and have not always found that they could access some of the relief resources through the PPP program and so forth. So, looking at some of those non-traditional ways to stand up and support those businesses like CDFIs and other, business relief models, I think that's really important. And it just seems like there's a lot of synergy between where the business community is evolving and where I think some of our leadership in the General Assembly is going to realize we got to think outside the box. One of the things that many people know about me is if the best reason you can defend what you're doing is that's the way we've always been doing it, that is the least compelling reason for me to believe that is the best path forward. So I think we're moving in a direction where this is how we've been doing it is not going to pass the smell test for even more people, because we realize we've had to adjust. This pandemic has thrust people into discomfort, but sometimes I firmly believe, well, actually, it's not sometimes. You're never going to have a breakthrough without discomfort. You're never going to have lasting transformation without discomfort. You have to get through it to get to something better. And you might not contemplate that better is even needed until you're put in a position where you're kind of left with no choice. So for the Baltimore City delegation, we're definitely going to be thinking about economic relief. We're definitely going to be thinking about how we address, our police department and the delivery of public safety services. But I also know that some of the things that are important to public safety are also related to some of the things we talked about in our state budget. So many people who have not only fallen victim to violence, but have also been, accused of perpetrating violence are people that are under state supervision. And we've had, a steady decline in investments in parole and probation, and a lot of the different professionals that are really tasked with ensuring that people can actually upon their release, be productive. So we know that all the impediments to really, flying straight and being successful, they're rooted in the fact that our transportation isn't as good as it could be. It's rooted in the fact that there's a need for additional workforce development training that's really targeting people that have either limited skills or a limited resume of certain work experiences, but maybe have the capabilities and just need proper training and opportunities. So, I really think that for Baltimore and the region, we have to think about some of those nuts and bolts of what makes a place livable, what makes a place economically competitive. And things don't change just because of the pandemic. That's why you see members of our delegation really putting forth legislation, looking at how we can ensure that the Maryland Transit Authority is adequately funded, that we can make sure that our existing infrastructure is as safe as possible, and that we can ramp up. Because one of the things that has been noticeable is that there has been a decline in transit ridership across the country, but in Maryland, it's actually been a lot stronger in the Baltimore region than even the region closer to DC, because we have the most transit dependent population in Baltimore City and many people going to essential workforce jobs in healthcare. So I think that through this pandemic, we've shown our mettle and need for expanded and stronger transportation as a key to connecting people to opportunities. So I'm hoping that we get a stronger reception on those needs, and I stand at the ready to defend and fight for them, because I believe it's not only a key to getting us through this moment, it's a key to us attracting the types of businesses that we would like to see in this region, because many businesses and the workers that are going to work for them are going to be looking at access to public transit that's efficient and affordable as a key to where they're prioritizing their investments as a business. So I think that we need to elevate that conversation, and it's not a secondary concern through the pandemic. It's actually a part of us getting through this in a sustainable way. And I know we don't have much time left. I'm picking up the rear, so I really want to make sure we recognize opportunities for questions. But one of the things that I shared the last time I was here, and I was fortunate to be in person, is that oftentimes when people talk about issues of public safety and issues of economic development, they seem to think, well, what does that have to do with the other? And I always tell people this: I want to have the fewest amount of desperate people around me, because I am safer when the people around me have their basic needs met. You're safer when the people around you have their basic needs met. So when they have a job, when they have opportunity, when they're living in a way not over 30 or 40% of their take-home pay is dedicated to their housing needs, you are living in a safer community. So these are not issues that are at odds, they are one and the same. And I think investing in people is one of the best ways we can live in a safer Baltimore and a safer Maryland. So I look forward to hearing questions from those that woke up early with us today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Delegate. As we start the Q&A, let me just pick up on your points about transit. By following up on David's initial presentation, you talked about a lot of money going to WMATA, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Agency, the Washington Metro. How is the rest of it being distributed in Baltimore City and other places in the state?
Most of the rest of the transportation money that, for transit does go to the Transit Administration. The December stimulus had about $76 million for the Transit Administration. The CARES Act had a couple $100 million for the Transit Administration. So the December stimulus also had about $149 million for state highways. We have not seen how the administration plans to use that money, but it'll help support, road maintenance and so forth.
I have a million questions for David, but let me pick up on something that was in the Q&A box here, which is addressing the learning loss that's gone in. It's been going on over the last 9 or 10 months, kids out of classrooms. I have to think that there are some kids just thriving with distance learning. A lot of kids probably treading water. A lot of kids, unfortunately, not doing as well, depending on their age. But wow, how great would it be to be the 14 or 15-year-old student who has now mastered distance learning, and the world is your oyster. There's all these online open courses, the best universities, their best teachers. You can just learn anything. But for so many people, as I mentioned at the beginning, it hasn't been a choice between virtual school or real school. It's been no school at all. And of course, you think about how much algebra we used to forget over a short summer. And if they've not had any formal instruction for the equivalent of 4 or 5 summer breaks, how much backsliding there is. I know we have 2 educators with us at least. What what should we be doing? Blue sky, if you could do anything, and we saw that there's some tutoring money. How do we help the kids who have fallen behind?
I think, we all may have some thoughts on it beyond just the two of us who are educators, because we're all experiencing it in different ways. I've got 4 kids. So online learning has been tough. I think like anything else with the pandemic, online learning has continued to reveal inequalities. And you're right. I think there are some kids who are doing well, and there are a lot of kids who aren't, and a lot of kids who are struggling, not just academically, but in terms of, mental and emotional health. I think our society has a lot to answer for as a result of that. But to your question, I think the most immediate thing we can do is to adequately fund the type of individualized tutoring that can identify the kids who have fallen behind the most and provide them with specific individualized interventions that will help them catch up. And that starts, frankly, now. This is an idea, again, a bipartisan idea. We've seen the governor put some additional money for tutoring in his budget. I know our budget folks, Maggie McIntosh in the House, are looking closely to see if it's adequate. But that's the single best thing we can do, is get that individualized tutoring money funded. And then, over the long term, because you don't solve learning loss overnight, make sure that we're adequately funding our schools over the long term. And to me, that means overriding the governor's veto of the blueprint for Maryland's future.
Yeah, I totally agree with the House Majority Leader. Tutoring is the answer at the end of the day. That's not cheap. It costs to do it well. It also requires us to really be able to assess what loss has happened. That's not for a high stakes purpose. That's not for punishing people, but we need to be able to know where kids are. And so there has to be some level of consistency to know where kids are, so that we can have individualized learning plans for them to be able to catch up. And then, of course, hopefully in the shorter term, getting kids back in school is probably one of the best things that we can do, but it has to be done safely. And this is a very, very hard question. It should not be parents versus teachers. It should not be districts versus government. This has to be a really thoughtful conversation. We have to have clear metrics. We have to have clear protocols. And the key is we have got to increase the efficiency and speed at which we are vaccinating people, particularly teachers, and even more specifically, early childhood teachers, because I think the younger kids are the ones who are the most susceptible. I have a first grader who is, let's call it sort of reading. And this has been really tough. You think about the kindergartners, the 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, I am very, very concerned about the impact of sort of this excessive screen time and sort of reliance on a screen to try and teach. I mean, the young kids are the ones who I am most concerned about. And so we have got to get these vaccinations out. It's why we launched this vaccination work group, is to get teachers vaccinated. It's one of the major reasons. We need to get teachers and essential workers vaccinated so that we can get kids back to school.
Can I add one thing to this? And also, I'm in solidarity with the Senate President, because we're both in first grade probably regularly, more than we ever thought we would be at this age in our life. But I wanted to lift up, in addition, those seniors or people maybe 11th grade. Some of them we're losing, that we might not have an opportunity to engage with them in a school setting again. And I don't want that to get lost, because this is a moment in time in some people's career, or a moment in time for other professionals. But for that 11th or 12th grader that has now maybe even entered the workforce, there may not be an opportunity to get them back in school as we know it in terms of high school. So we really do need to think outside the box about, is there going to need to be almost a hybrid model where they can continue to earn money and maybe get their degree in a different way? Because I'm really concerned that population is being missed. Some of our understanding of this situation is anecdotal. The data will bear itself out, but there are some young adults that have just not been captured in this remote moment. They might have a smartphone, but you cannot conduct learning efficiently on a phone. So if these young people don't have access to Wi-Fi in a home setting and adequate infrastructure, some of them have moved into the workforce, and they are likely to be locked into low-wage employment for the remainder of their adult life if they do not get the skills and education they need. So I just wanted to lift that up.
Yeah, it's critical, beyond critical issue. Let me just read a question you can probably see in the Q&A box. Given that hospitality and tourism is typically one of the state's most robust industries and has been hit harder than other sectors, have you considered policies to incentivize patronage of these businesses and exempting businesses or these industries from new tax increases until they have a chance to recover? What can we do? What should the state do to help out hospitality and tourism?
Yeah, I mean, I could just quickly jump in, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but everything comes back down to public health. We will not get tourism back. We will not get restaurants back. We will not get the economy roaring again until we deal with the public health crisis. That is entirely contingent on vaccinations and a strong vaccination program. So in a place, the 46th district that I represent, in which tourism is the heart and soul of what we do, it will be we could have the greatest tax policy, the greatest stimulus plan. If we don't have public health, if we don't have the virus under control, none of it matters. So we have to focus and prioritize. Of course, the governor put in about $2 million, I think, for marketing for tourism in Maryland. That will be necessary. We'll do some other stimulus activities to make sure, but all of it is contingent on this vaccination program working effectively.
I think I'll just, Jeff, add a yes. And I think whatever stimulus or anything like it that we do should be targeted to those industries which have been most deeply affected by this, right? And that's my concern with, the governor's sales tax proposal. I mean, I think we need to look at the businesses that have been hit the hardest and design interventions that will help them specifically. For example, the Montgomery County delegation of the General Assembly just passed a local bill out of delegation on Friday that would exempt our bars and restaurants from alcohol license fees for 1 year. That's only a few $100s, but that's a few $100s that can make a difference between, a small business staying open or a small business closing. And those are the types of, highly specific targeted interventions in hotels and restaurants and bars and, tourism related businesses and personal services. Those are the things we need to be focusing on.
Hey, Jeff, if I can just add, the last part of her question, I believe, was, will we commit to not raising taxes on them or doing any further taxes? And I think absolutely we should not be raising taxes on anybody right now. I mean, the first thing we should do is do no harm, do no further harm. And so, there's been a lot of talk about, helping different communities out. And look, in Western Maryland, we have a lot of poverty in our rural communities. I've got communities that have major infrastructure problems. I'm just trying to help them have clean water. Believe it or not, there's people in my district that don't even have clean water to drink. But I want to point out in my county, for a middle class family, it costs $109,000. According to United Way, just did a study, $109,000 just to pay your basic bills for your health insurance, your housing costs. So if you have a family with two children, two parents, two children, $109,000 just to pay your basic costs. So it's very expensive in a lot of parts of Maryland, parts of my county to live and get by. So the last thing we need to do is make it harder on people in a pandemic, an expensive state, and a high tax state is to raise any more taxes.
Jeff, if I could just jump back in for a second. I appreciate the senator's comments. I will say, I think for decades, the conversation about taxes has been far too simplistic, right? The conversation shouldn't be all taxes are bad or all taxes are good. It should be, let's do taxes right. So the legislature is going to be considering veto overrides, and I hope overriding vetoes of 3 revenue bills that we passed last year, all of which are targeted towards fairness in the tax system. So why is it that a GameStop video game store in Maryland that employs Marylanders is required to collect sales taxes, but the exact same game purchased at Steam, which is an online site that doesn't employ any Marylanders, doesn't have to charge sales taxes? That hurts Maryland businesses. Why is it that your small businesses, your Maryland businesses, have to pay their fair share of taxes, and Facebook and Google don't have to pay a dime, and they make billions of dollars off of Marylanders? I think the conversation shouldn't be about higher, lower taxes. I think it should be about fairness in taxes. And if we can make sure everyone's paying their fair share and decrease tax rates on everyone, like Ronald Reagan did in 1986, I think that's a good thing.
I'd like to see that. I've never seen us cut taxes in my 12 years I've been in the General Assembly. I'd love to see it for once. So if you have a proposal to cut taxes for everyone in Maryland, I'll be the first to sign up because I've never seen that in my 12 years happen.
Deal. We'll have a Luedke Huff bill.
Can't wait to see the Luedke Huff bill. You know, I was thinking the way to stimulate tourism in Baltimore is for the legislature to mandate that the baseball team can't be bad this year.
Oh, in a heartbeat. If we
yeah,
could, we would.
Yeah, you'll have huge. I mean, you're going to have huge crowds as soon as people can go out. It's going to go crazy. David, without getting too deep into the weeds here, your projections included the most recent federal stimulus, but probably don't include whatever is about to come out of Washington, whatever part of the Biden plan makes it through Congress. What's the impact of that going to be? Also, the impact, assuming there's an override of Kerwin, and then this gets a little complicated. But the last federal tax overhaul put a limit on deducting state and local taxes, which had the effect, and they also raised the standard deduction. It had the effect, because of the way Maryland law works, of forcing more people to do something that was disadvantageous to them on their state taxes, which is take the standard deduction instead of itemizing. If that all goes away, what's the budget impact of that?
Yeah, lots of questions there. Let's start with an additional federal stimulus. I mean, obviously the governor's budget makes no assumptions about additional federal stimulus that Congress hasn't acted on. I find it a bad idea to try to predict what Congress is going to do. They never do what I think they're going to do. So I'm not going to try to guess at what kind of dollars we'll see or what things they'll be targeted to. I do think it's very possible, though, that the budget the General Assembly passes at the end of session will be quite different than the one that's been introduced, because if there is another stimulus, could certainly change the priorities and with the mix of funds being used to support different things. And as I mentioned earlier, the December stimulus money is also not in the budget yet. So that money will also come in at some point and be allocated for various purposes. So the budget the governor submitted is the starting point. I think we'll see the governor make tweaks to it as the session goes on, and the General Assembly make tweaks to it as the session goes on. On Kerwin, for fiscal 22, the budget the governor's proposed, there's no impact whether there's a veto override or not. The issue is that the Kerwin legislation would certainly increase state spending by more than $1 billion pretty quickly. The state has been putting money into what we call the Blueprint Fund to fund the Kerwin initiatives. And there's also the Education Trust Fund. The voters a few years ago approved a lockbox where most of the casino revenues that come to the state will go into the lockbox and also be used to support education. So on an ongoing basis, we have about $1 billion of revenue being set aside each year to pay for education enhancements. So there's a lot of money there to pay for Kerwin. So in the near term, the next 4 years or so, those dedicated revenues would pay for a Kerwin override if there is an override. If you go further out into the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th year, there will need to be general funds to subsidize it, and that number will get over $400 or $500 million. But again, that's 7 or 8 years away. But there will need to be more state dollars put in. The SALT deduction, I don't know off the top of my head the total numbers. It would definitely have a significant impact on the state if the Congress were to change that. There would probably need to be some reconsideration of some of the state laws. We made some adjustments when they got rid of the SALT deduction, so we might need to undo some of those things, but I don't have the number off the top of my head.
Let's throw it back to Don Fry.
Thank you very much, and thank you again to all of our panelists for I thought it was a very good discussion, covered a lot of areas, and appreciate that very much. Thank you for all attending today's Greater Baltimore Committee Legislative Forum. I think as you heard from our distinguished panel, there's a session as always has had a flurry of activity. This year possesses many opportunities for some transformational changes in the state of Maryland, and we can anticipate that the pace is only going to increase as we until we reach sine die in April. As the session progresses, the GBC will be maintaining an active presence advocating for legislation that will lead to a safer and more economically prosperous state of Maryland and Baltimore region. On February 10th, we're going to be hosting another newsmaker program entitled Power Shift in Washington, a view from the press, featuring 3 national reporters from the New York Times, USA Today, and Washington Post. We hope you'll join us for what will be a fascinating discussion on the changing dynamics in DC. We welcome you to follow our legislative activities on gbc.org and welcome your engagement on any public policy committee of the GBC. If you're interested in getting involved, please feel free to contact Jeremy Rosendale, who is our Director of Membership and External Affairs. Again, thank you for joining today, and also thanks to our sponsors, BGE, CareFirst, University of Maryland Medical System, AT&T, MedStar Health, Merit Companies, Comcast, Harris Jones and Malone, and the Daily Record. And again, finally, thank you to our panelists for taking time from their busy schedules to participate in today's program, but also particularly for the public service that they're providing to the citizens of the state of Maryland. That's something that we certainly need to be very mindful of and during these challenging times, and thank them for everything they do. And Jeff, thank you again for all your support for this program. Again, that concludes today's program. Thank you for attending. Be safe, stay healthy, get vaccinated, and remain positive. Have a great day.